April 20th, 1945, 13 hours. Seelow Heights, 60 kilometers east of Berlin. The earth itself was bleeding. General Oberst Gotthard Heinrici, commander of Army Group Vistula, stood in the mouth of a dugout, the air thick with brick dust and the sulphurous stench of cordite. He was a small, wire-thin man of the old Prussian school, a master of the defensive battle. But this was not a battle, it was an extinction. For 4 days, Marshal Zhukov's First Belarusian Front had been pounding his lines. Over 40,000 Soviet artillery pieces, a density of firepower unseen in human history, had systematically pulverized his divisions. His men, a tragic collection of Volkssturm, Hitler Youth, and the skeletal remnants of veteran units, were being liquefied. Heinrici watched through his binoculars as a 15-year-old boy, his helmet impossibly large, tried to fire a Panzerfaust before being consumed by the blast from a T-34. The Seelow Heights, the last defensible line before Berlin, had just broken. Heinrici's Ninth Army was in a full chaotic retreat, and Zhukov's road to the capital was now wide open. In his breast pocket, a flimsy piece of paper felt heavier than a steel plate. It was a teletype message, received an hour prior. It was not a request for a situation report. It was a command from the Führerbunker in Berlin. It ordered him to detach his best SS formations, the ones that were already ceasing to exist, and prepare them for a new grand counteroffensive. It was an order from a man who was clearly not on the same planet, let alone in the same war. Simultaneously, 13:30 hours. The Führerbunker, Berlin. The air in the concrete sarcophagus, 50 feet beneath the blasted gardens of the Reich Chancellery, was a thick, unbreathable soup of stale cigar smoke, body odor, and the acrid smell of failing ventilation. The constant distant rumble of Soviet artillery was a dull physical pressure, a heartbeat of the apocalypse. But today the rumble was being ignored. It was April 20th. It was the Führer's 56th birthday. A funereal procession of the Third Reich's pallbearers shuffled down the steps to offer their congratulations. Hermann Göring, bloated and sweating in a pale uniform, his pockets full of crystal vials. Heinrich Himmler, his face a mask of nervous obsequiousness, already planning his betrayal. Joseph Goebbels, a shrunken, fanatical goblin, his wife Magda at his side, her eyes gleaming with a martyr's ecstasy. And the generals. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Reichsfeldmarschall, Chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, his ramrod posture a pathetic lie. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, OKW Operations Chief, the cold architect of Hitler's failed strategies. General Hans Krebs, the new Chief of the Army General Staff, his face perpetually slick with sweat. Hitler himself emerged from his private quarters, a grotesque parody of the man who had conquered Europe. His skin was sallow, his left hand trembled violently, and a string of saliva hung from his lip. He shuffled down the line, clasped his loyalists, receiving their final empty praise. It was a party at the end of the world, and in the adjacent conference room, a massive map table lay waiting, covered in red and blue grease pencil markings that depicted a reality that existed only in one man's mind. The disconnect between the blood on Heinrici's Seelow Heights and the champagne in Keitel's glass was no longer a crack. It was a canyon, and into this canyon, the entire German general staff was about to fall. The military situation in late April 1945 was not complex. It was terminal. The Third Reich, which had once stretched from the Volga to the Atlantic, was now a small, shrinking pocket of land, bleeding out from 1,000 wounds. The Americans and British were across the Rhine and racing for the Elbe. The Soviets had launched their final, colossal offensive. Stalin had unleashed a force of 2.5 million men, 6,250 tanks and 7,500 aircraft, divided into two massive fronts, a pincer designed to crush Berlin. In the north, Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front, the force that had just shattered General Heinrici's defenses at Seelow. From the south, Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front had crossed the Neisse River and was driving deep into Germany's unprotected flank. The two fronts were in a brutal race, egged on by Stalin, who demanded the Reichstag be taken by May 1st. By April 20th, Zhukov's long-range artillery was already shelling the city center. The Battle of Berlin had begun. Inside the Führerbunker, the daily reality was the Lagerbesprechung, the military conference. The centerpiece was the map, but this map was a work of pure fiction. Hitler, his eyes clouded by cataracts and his mind by Parkinson's and narcotics, was no longer a commander. He was a necromancer, moving the pins of armies that were long dead. The defense of Berlin rested on this fantasy. The city itself had no real defenders. The garrison was a pathetic joke. 45,000 men, mostly Volkssturm, old men and teenagers, police and fire brigades, bolstered by a few thousand exhausted Wehrmacht and SS stragglers. The fortifications were ditches and tram barricades. The real defense in Hitler's mind was to be a grand Napoleonic counterstroke. He pointed at the map with a trembling finger. The entire plan rested on two ghost armies. The 12th Army. To the west, General Walter Wenck's 12th Army, a new formation created from training schools and convalescing soldiers, was supposedly holding the line against the Americans. Hitler ordered Wenck to turn 180 degrees and attack east to smash into Konev's flank and rescue Berlin. Army Detachment Steiner. This was the linchpin. To the north of Berlin, Hitler had conjured a new force under the command of a hard-bitten SS general, Felix Steiner. Armeeabteilung Steiner was, on paper, a powerful SS panzer force. Hitler ordered Steiner to launch a massive, decisive pincer attack from the north, cutting south to roll up Zhukov's entire flank and link up with the 9th Army. This was the plan. It was Frederick the Great. It was a masterpiece of operational maneuver. It was also completely, utterly, and psychotically impossible. Wenck's army was barely holding on, and Army Detachment Steiner, as the generals in the bunker were about to discover, did not exist. To be a general in the Führerbunker in April 1945 was to live in a state of cognitive dissonance so profound it bordered on psychosis. These were not stupid men. Keitel, Jodl, and Krebs were the products of the elite German general staff. They could read a map. They could read a supply report. They knew what a 10-to-1 disadvantage in tanks meant. They knew what zero fuel and zero ammunition meant. But they were trapped, not by Soviet tanks, but by their own psychological complicity. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, the Iron Marshal, chief of the OKW. His loyalty to Hitler was absolute, pathological. His nickname among his peers was La Keitel, a pun on the German word for lackey. Keitel's job was not to provide military advice. It was to nod to say, "Ja, mein Führer," and to transmit Hitler's fantasies to the front. He was a hollow man, a uniform filled with terror and obedience. His reality was whatever Hitler said it was. Generaloberst Alfred Jodl, the operations chief. Colder, more intelligent, and more cynical than Keitel, Jodl was the true architect. He was the one who translated Hitler's rages into operational orders. For years, he had been the ultimate rationalizer. Hitler's intuition, he argued, had saved them before. Jodl lived in a world of maps, and as long as the map could be drawn, the plan was possible. But even he was reaching his limit. The rumble from the Tiergarten above was a sound he could no longer filter out. General Hans Krebs, the new Army Chief of Staff, OKH, having replaced the defiant Heinz Guderian. Krebs was a tragic figure. He was a professional, competent staff officer who knew, better than anyone, the precise state of every battalion on the Eastern Front. He was the man who received Heinrich's desperate reports. He saw the numbers. He knew Steiner had no divisions. But his job required him to stand before Hitler and pretend. He was a man being crushed to death between two realities, his face a constant mask of perspiration, his hands shaking as he updated the fantasy map. These men were the last believers, not in victory but in the Führer. Their entire world, their careers, their honor, and their crimes were built upon the Führerprinzip, the leader principle. The idea that Hitler was a genius. If Hitler was wrong, not just mistaken but delusional, then everything they had done, the millions of deaths, the destruction of Germany, was not a tragic sacrifice. It was a meaningless criminal farce. They were psychologically incapable of accepting that truth. Their own sanity depended on Hitler's, and it was about to break. While Hitler was planning his grand pincer, Joseph Stalin was planning a party. For the Soviet premier, the Battle of Berlin was not a military operation. It was a foregone conclusion. It was an act of historical vengeance, a ritual of humiliation, and most critically, a political power play. He did not trust his allies, the Americans, who were already at the Elbe River just 100 kilometers away. He was terrified they would cut a deal and take Berlin from him. His enemy was not Hitler. His enemy was his own generals. He had pitted his two greatest marshals against each other in a sociopathic race, Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the conqueror of Berlin, a proud, brutal, and effective commander. His first Belarusian front had the glory position, the direct central axis and the prize of the Reichstag. Marshal Ivan Konev, a brilliant, ruthless tactician. His first Ukrainian front was angled to attack from the south, tasked with encircling the Ninth Army. Stalin had drawn a simple line on the map. Zhukov was not to cross it to the south. Konev was not to cross it to the north, but he had left the line open at Berlin. It was a silent invitation. Whoever gets there first, he told them, gets the glory. The Soviet Stavka, high command intelligence, was excellent. They knew the German order of battle was a phantom. They knew the Volkssturm had no weapons. They knew the Wehrmacht was on the verge of total collapse. They were expecting a desperate, suicidal, block-by-block defense, a rat war, Rattenkrieg like Stalingrad, but in reverse. They were prepared for fanaticism, for Hitler Youth with Panzerfausts in every sewer. What they were not expecting, what they did not even consider, was a coherent, large-scale, operational counteroffensive from the north. The idea of an Army Detachment Steiner smashing into Zhukov's flank was, to them, laughable. It didn't factor into their plans for a single moment. They were not worried about their flanks. They were worried about reaching the Reichstag before the other marshal. Their entire expectation was a grind, not a duel. The birthday celebrations of April 20th were a hollow, ghoulish affair. The real drama began 2 days later, on the afternoon of Sunday, April 22nd. The situation had deteriorated from catastrophic to apocalyptic. Zhukov's tanks were no longer just shelling the center. They were in the northern and eastern suburbs. Konev's tanks, having smashed through from the south, were already in the southern suburbs of Zossen, having just overrun the OKH's main communications bunker. The noose was tight. The Lagebesprechung began at 15 hours. The air in the conference room was radioactive with tension. The usual sycophants were present: Keitel, Jodl, Krebs, Bergdorf. Also present were Hitler's adjutants and the party bosses, Martin Bormann and Joseph Goebbels. Hitler, more stooped and gray than ever, shuffled to the map. His voice was a hoarse, shaky whisper. He pointed to the north of Berlin. "And the attack by Steiner?" he asked. "What is the progress of Steiner's attack?" The room fell silent. The sound of the ventilation, the rumble of the artillery, and the violent, uncontrollable shaking of Hitler's left hand, which he clutched behind his back, were the only sounds. General Krebs, the man who knew the answer, began to sweat. He looked at his notes. He looked at Jodl. He couldn't speak. "Mein Führer," Krebs began, his voice cracking. "The situation? Steiner has been unable to." Hitler cut him off, his voice rising in irritation. "Where is Steiner? His attack was to be the linchpin. He was to disengage the SS and attack." It was Jodl who finally spoke, his voice cold and clinical. "Mein Führer, Steiner's forces are insufficient. He has been unable to disengage. The formations, they are not divisions. They are at best a few battalions. They have no tanks. They have no ammunition." Hitler stared at him, uncomprehending. "But he was ordered to attack. I ordered him." It was at this point that SS General Hermann Fegelein, Himmler's liaison and Eva Braun's brother-in-law, chimed in, trying to defend his SS comrade. "Mein Führer, Steiner is on the line. He says he cannot and will not attack. He says he has no forces and the attack is suicide." This was the trigger. The word cannot, the open defiance, the final brutal intrusion of reality into the fantasy. Hitler's face, pale and sallow moments before, turned a dark, blotchy purple. His entire body began to shake, not with Parkinson's but with an inhuman volcanic rage. He shot up from his chair. His voice, high and screeching, clawed at the concrete walls. "Traitors!" he screamed. He slammed his fist on the massive oak map table, sending the little pins and markers flying. "I am surrounded by traitors. I have been betrayed from the very beginning." The generals stood frozen like statues. They had seen his rages before, but this was different. This was not a performance. This was a collapse. "The generals!" he shrieked, his eyes wild, flecks of spittle flying from his mouth. "All of them! The Wehrmacht has done nothing but lie to me. They have deceived me. For years." He turned on Keitel and Jodl, his finger trembling. You have done nothing but oppose me. You are a coward." He raged for 20 minutes. He screamed that the SS, his loyal SS, had now betrayed him. He screamed that he should have liquidated the entire general staff years ago. Like Stalin, he paced the small room like a caged, dying animal, his voice breaking into sobs. And then, as suddenly as it began, the rage vanished. He physically deflated. He collapsed into his chair, a spent, broken old man. The room was utterly silent. Hitler's voice was a dead, hollow whisper. It is over, he said, staring at the map. The war is lost. He took a shallow breath. But if you think, gentlemen, that I will leave Berlin, you are mistaken. I will not. I will stay here. I will defend my capital. When the moment comes, I will shoot myself. It is all finished. This was the moment. The moment was not the rage. It was the admission. It was the sound of the Führer himself, the God King, the man whose will was the only strategy left, admitting that his will was broken. The greatest warlord of all time had just abdicated. The generals in the room did not move. They were not horrified. They were not even afraid. They were paralyzed. The psychological bomb that had just detonated was far more powerful than any Soviet shell. The Führerprinzip, the central organizing principle of their entire universe, the belief that it justified every order, every atrocity, and every sacrifice, had just evaporated. The man they had followed into the abyss, the man whose genius they had used to rationalize the disaster at Stalingrad and the failure at Kursk, was sitting before them, weeping, a delusional wreck who had just admitted his entire plan was a fantasy. They had known in their private, cowardly hearts that the war was lost for months, but now he had said it. The spell was broken. The unexpected outcome was not a coup. It was not a desperate last-ditch attempt to save Germany. It was the opposite. It was a complete and total psychological implosion of the German high command. Hitler's breakdown gave them the out they had all secretly craved. The realization of his delusion didn't spur them to act. It paralyzed them, freeing them from all responsibility. I will stay, Hitler repeated, his voice dead. All of you. You may leave. It makes no difference now. He then turned to Keitel and Jodl. You will fly south to Berchtesgaden. You will command the southern redoubt from there. Keitel and Jodl, the two highest-ranking soldiers in the Reich, the men who should have been commanding the defense of the nation, simply obeyed. They didn't protest. They didn't try to take command. Their God had told them to leave the deathbed, and they fled like thieves in the night. Their moment of realization was immediately followed by a final, pathetic act of abdication. They were no longer generals. They were just high-level fugitives, running from a reality they could no longer deny, leaving a madman in a bunker to die. The psychological shockwave of Hitler's April 22nd breakdown bifurcated the bunker's inhabitants into two distinct camps, the rats and the martyrs, the Great Escape. For the pragmatists and the opportunists, Hitler's admission that the war was lost was a starting gun. The Führer had released them. The oath of loyalty was void. Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarshal, was already in the south. When he heard of Hitler's collapse, he saw his chance. He immediately sent the infamous Göring telegram, politely asking Hitler if he should, as his designated successor, take full command of the Reich. For Göring, the moment was a green light for a coup. Hitler, in a final spasm of rage, stripped him of his titles and ordered him arrested. Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, the architect of the Holocaust, was already in the north. He too saw the writing on the wall. The moment of his Führer's delusion convinced him it was time to save himself. He secretly met with Count Folke Bernadotte of the Swedish Red Cross, offering to surrender all German forces in the West to General Eisenhower, in an insane, last-ditch hope that the Allies would join him in a new war against the Soviet Union. The Suicide Pact. For the true believers, the moment had the opposite effect. If the Führer was delusional, then reality was the enemy. If Hitler's world was ending, their world must end too. They were not just soldiers or politicians. They were priests of a dead religion. Joseph Goebbels. The propaganda minister moved his entire family, including his 6 young children, into the bunker. Hitler's delusion was his delusion. He saw the moment not as a defeat, but as the first act of a grand Wagnerian opera, Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods. He would not flee. He would provide the final theatrical climax. Generals Krebs and Bergdorf, they were the military wing of the Suicide Pact. They were professional soldiers who now had no profession. They had no army. They had no Führer. Their moment of realization was a death sentence. They had lied to Hitler, and they had lied to themselves for too long. There was no southern redoubt for them. There was only the bottle of cognac in the bunker's canteen and a Luger pistol. They stayed, not to command, but to die. The Third Reich did not end on April 22nd, but its command structure did. For the final agonizing 8 days, the Führerbunker was not a military headquarters. It was a mausoleum in waiting, a grotesque theater of the absurd. Hitler, having abdicated to his generals, spent his remaining time in a haze of contradictory rages and surreal normality. He would emerge from his quarters to command his last ghost army, General Wenck's 12th Army. He would get on the radio, demanding that Wenck break the siege. "Where is Wenck?" became the new "Where is Steiner?" But Wenck, like Heinrici, was a realist. He knew Hitler was delusional. The moment of realization had already rippled out to the last field commanders. Wenck did not obey the letter of the law, but the spirit. He attacked, but his real secret mission was not to save Hitler. It was to push east just far enough to open a humanitarian corridor, allowing the remnants of the 9th Army and tens of thousands of terrified civilians to escape. The Soviet advance and surrendered to the Americans at the Elbe. Wenck's attack was the first great act of post-Nazi Germany, an act of rescue, disguised as an act of obedience. The moment in the bunker, that final screeching breakdown over a non-existent army, stands as the ultimate tragic lesson of the Führerprinzip. The generals who had built their world on the myth of one man's genius were psychologically incapable of acting when that myth was finally, violently, exposed. They knew he was delusional. They saw it with their own eyes. They heard it with their own ears, but they were too small, too complicit, and too cowardly to stop the machine. Their paralysis ensured that the war would grind on for another pointless week, costing another 100,000 lives, as they waited for a delusional man to finally pull the trigger, and in doing so, give them all permission to stop fighting.